complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side, and like, man, messed up.
All right, Eugyppius, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm all right. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to appear on your podcast.
Definitely. I was thinking about this, after we agreed to record, that I think the first time I heard you was relatively late compared to when you started posting. I think I believe you appeared on Kashuda, and I think that's where I heard your work first.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. I think that was the first interview I ever did.
It was quite good, and since then I've been following your work. I know that you got started, at least I became aware of you because of COVID, but you've continued your career as a commentator. I've got your your Substack linked, which is quite worth everyone's time. But I do want to jump into the topic at hand. You have been covering a series of political protests in Germany. So do you want to introduce those and kind of explain why this is relevant or interesting?
Yeah, of course. So the most important, we can go all the way back to September 2021, and we had big elections every 5 years. The Bundestag, the parliament, is elected again, and the CDU, after a long time of Merkel, they did not do very well. We had a new coalition government formed by the Social Democrats, so the SPD, by the libertarians, liberal libertarians in the FDP, very small party, and by the Greens, the first time the Greens have been in government. So this is the traffic light coalition because the colors, FDP are yellow, SPD, Social Democrats are red, and Greens are green. And they had to somehow, the three of them had to somehow form a program for government. And you have the two big leftist parties, the Greens and the Social Democrats. Of course, they have their big technocratic energy transition plans. They have their social entitlement plans. But their junior partners, the FDP, the only reason you vote for the FDP is you don't want any more taxes. It's the only reason you vote for this stupid party. And so the FDP could not countenance joining the coalition if there was going to be any tax increases. So their agreement, the coalition agreement, was that taxes would stay the same, and all of these socialist fantasies and the energy transition would be funded via reappropriated COVID emergency funds. So in 2021, early in the year, Merkel's government, they applied for special emergency credit authorization to get additional 60 billion euros to spend on whatever pandemic stuff. And the amazing thing is they never spent this money. So it was just hanging around. And because in Germany, unlike the United States, we have very strict spending debt limits, which are actually in our constitution. So debt is pegged to a certain percentage of GDP, so that you can't just print more money here. It's not that easy. So the way they would get around this is they would reappropriate the COVID emergency funds for climate stuff and welfare stuff. Now what happened is the CDU immediately sued, alleging that reappropriating emergency funds was unconstitutional. And I was very surprised, but in November 2023, the Federal Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe finally decided that indeed this was unconstitutional. This was, for me, a big surprise, though some predict this would happen. I was wrong. And what this means is that now $60 billion, the whole scheme, the whole method of government, the whole, in many ways, raison d'etre of the coalition is now been subverted and the money is gone. So FDP still can't agree to raise taxes. That would be even more political suicide for them than being in the coalition itself is. And the money is missing. So they've been trying to reconstruct their budgets. They've managed to move money around and save stuff here and there, but there's still 17 billion euros which are missing. And they're desperate to raise funds from literally any corner. And meanwhile, the popularity is just in the gutter because socialist governments that can't spend money, nobody likes them, right? So one of the solutions here was that they would not raise taxes. Remember, FDP can't do that. That they would cancel what are marketed as subsidies for agriculture. So they would remove subsidies on agricultural diesel, and they would remove special vehicle tax exemptions for agricultural vehicles. And the calculation, I guess, is that as a percentage of the workforce, farmers are relatively small, about 2% of German workforce, so they wouldn't be able to do very much about it. And but of course, it should be said these are subsidies only in the parlance of the government. These are really tax rebates. So this is effectively a tax increase anyway. And the farmers may be a small percentage of the workforce, but they're extremely well organized. And when this decision was announced in December, they immediately announced basically protests nationwide, which they planned for the period after Christmas. And what happened is the farmers' protest, originally about this very specific tax issue, ballooned massively. Truckers joined them, tradesmen joined them, became about a much bigger dissatisfaction with the government, much bigger anti-Euro movement, and rapidly developed this momentum of its own. And that sort of brings us to today. So that's how it began. And there's a big week of protests scheduled all around the country, beginning on 8 January. They blocked all kinds of traffic. There are tractors everywhere. It's extremely visible. And it culminated in a big sort of march on Berlin, which I was there for. That was this past Monday.
So how does this relate to the energy crisis that has been affecting Europe more broadly since the Ukraine-Russia war started? So for those who aren't familiar, as far as I understand, Germany is a very energy-dependent economy. Much of the heavy manufacturing essentially depends on taking raw resources from elsewhere, using what would have been cheap energy from Russia and a high-skilled workforce, and combining those to make finished manufacturing goods, tools, automobiles, obviously, things like that are very energy intensive. So as you can imagine, it's a large part of the German economy that's been hit hard by Russian sanctions. But is this kind of another blow to the economy, or is it seen as a separate issue?
I would say that the discontent that the farmers' protests to some degree harnessed, that they helped also stir up more, is an important prerequisite for what happened this past week, and that is absolutely related to the energy crisis and to the energy transition. Two things. So yes, because of the EU sanctions against Russia, because of the whole Nord Stream catastrophe, or the attack, really, we should not be too generous there, the energy has become extremely expensive in Germany, and this has only been exacerbated by green policies trying to accomplish an energy transition by installing more and more renewable capacity in the grid, by shutting down our nuclear power plants, which means we have to import more electricity at a premium, above all from France. It's sort of still nuclear power, which is the joke here. We just pay more for it than we paid for our own. And so there's this groundswell of discontent in general, right? Everyone is upset. There's inflation. There's economic problems, and Germany is experiencing deindustrialization as a result both of green policies and of the Ukraine war and our stupid response to it. So yes, this was a prerequisite, and a huge part of the farmers' grievances aren't directly related to these tax hikes at all, but to these much more general political and economic problems.
So this is not something I prepared you for, so it's all right if you don't know the answer. But common wisdom in American right-wing circles is that the U.S. State Department has the German Green movement as a proxy, and sort of a lot of the funding for German green causes come from the U.S. or U.S. NGOs, either directly or indirectly. Is that true? And what is the kind of German base for the Green Party?
Yeah, so this is also a widespread point of speculation and conspiracy theorizing in German circles as well. And I think there's a lot to this. There's maybe sort of two different aspects to mention here. One is where all of this environmental green advocacy in Germany comes from in the first place. This is much bigger than just the Green Party. We have a whole network of lobbying firms and NGOs and think tanks and God knows what else. And here, American interests are pretty clearly implicated. So a key player is someone who he's an American, but he only has a Wikipedia page in German. His name is Hal Harvey, and he works for, I believe, the Hewlett Foundation. So he basically allocates money from the Hewlett Foundation, and he has fought for years in Germany to set up an American-style lobbying network to push green policies. So this is independent but mutually supportive of the Green Party. The idea is that, so reading his own stuff, is that, you know, the fossil fuel industry or whatever have their own lobbying arms, and the environmentalists need the same thing. And so he set up this whole style of politics that really didn't exist in Germany before. He spent sort of the years for this are sort of really Merkel era, so mid-2000s all the way up until about 2015 or so, he was building these networks. And these lobbying organizations and these think tanks, what they do, which is very destructive, is they start infiltrating the civil service. And this really starts happening around 2007 in Germany, where we had sort of a lot of free market types in the sort of pre-Merkel civil service, and they're steadily replaced by green lunatics since then. And this is really downstream of American environmental advocacy. And the reason I think many conspiracies are possible, but I think the simplest and blandest explanation is that I think Europe enjoys a kind of a cultural prestige in the United States, in the New World, and there's this idea they can set up, you know, climate policies in sort of the provinces, the prestigious provinces, and then sell them as like, hey, Europeans are so sensible, they're doing this stuff, we need to do it here at home. So it's sort of this two-stage psyop, perhaps. That's one part of it.
Well, I think that you're definitely right. And the easiest place to see this is in Canada, right? And Canada is sort of it's more America than American, you know, and they define themselves entirely in relation to the American right wing and being better than that. And this is something that I think that we've realized very clearly over the last 4 years, is that a lot of American empire policy is just devoted to making libtards feel good on Twitter, you know, and we will do incredibly destructive things to promote that end.
Yes, so there's this small country effect, right? So whenever there's a small country next to a larger one, there's sort of a virtue signaling dynamic that emerges. So Sweden has behaved this way with respect to Europe throughout a lot of the 90s and early 2000s, trying to present itself as the more virtuous European power on the edge, you know, and Canada does this with respect to the United States, and Europe, to a large extent, also does this with respect to the US, and nowhere more so than Germany, because we are, you know, we're still, this is contentious, but we're still somewhat occupied by the United States. They're very much a big brother to us, and so this dynamic is very real.
Certainly. So that's not exactly what I brought you on to discuss, but I do think it is a relevant way to look at this, especially, you know, as we've talked about the extremely convenient explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline. I'll put it that way.
Yes. So there's the other aspect I wanted to address was the Green Party specifically, with respect to your question. Are they controlled by the U.S. State Department? How might that be possible? And I can just talk briefly about this, because we know the Green Party, when they emerged in after 1980, they were thoroughly infiltrated by East German agents, and they were largely controlled by East German spy agencies and by even Russia at one remove. So they were already sort of an avatar or a cutout for foreign interests back then. And sort of the theory about what's happened after the Cold War is that they went looking for a new senior partner and ended up somehow establishing the same relationship with American State Department. And there's definitely something to this theory. It's very hard to prove, but if you look how Greens behave, they're just relentless Atlanticists in a way that no other German party is. And you'd think that being sort of on the left and with their activist roots and so forth, they would be anything but pro-American. As you get more left in the Euro side, then you're anti-war and you deplore things like the Iraq War under Bush and so forth. But the Greens are the opposite of this, and it's a very bizarre sort of political manifestation, which is otherwise hard to explain, and I think must have something to do with interests like these.
Well, it's something you see because I'm in the US, but I live in an area with a lot of nuclear power. And so one of the major companies in my area it's an American company, but it's sort of sister companies with a large French nuclear company. And what's become very clear about that is there are kind of two main sectors. There's defense, which is, making nuclear reactors for submarines and aircrafts. And then there is nuclear power. And what's become very, very clear is the American empire hates civilian nuclear power. And it is sort of leaning on both the companies in the US, but also interests abroad to make that go away. And it's very difficult to point to a specific person, but taken as a whole, it's easy to identify. But anyway, back to the topic at hand, which is the current situation in Germany. So you've talked about this farmers' protest in response to sort of this need to raise money in German government. And so obviously part of this is just coalition building as far as politics goes, but it does seem like over the whole European Union, there's this war on farming and agriculture. Obviously, this happened in the Netherlands, which is a more agricultural economy, where there was this similar desire to essentially, get rid of farming. So how much of this do you see as a broader push, and how much do you see this as we just needed money and farmers aren't our clients, so we will punish them?
It's very much both. Of course, they go to the farmers initially because they're seen as political enemies, maybe a little bit too much, but they're definitely seen as a potentially hostile bloc, and they're not allied with any of the parties in the regime. So the FDP are sort of for corporate wealthy people, and the SPD and Greens are just sort of classic high-low, de Juvenelian political constructs. So the farmers definitely are on the losing side of this. It's absolutely at some level intentional, the imposition of strict environmental standards on food production, which actually just advantages cheap imports from countries where these standards don't apply, is a long-standing complaint of all farmers in the European Union. Of course, German policy since the traffic light government came to power has basically resulted in, it's been a de facto deindustrialization policy as we lose increasing industry overseas. Initiatives like the effort to ban internal combustion engines is hard to read as anything but a torpedo directed directly at a German automobile industry, which is one of our strongest industries and one where other countries like China couldn't really compete. But now they create a new electric vehicle industry where there's a lot of scrambling for expertise and design and patents and everything. And suddenly China can now get in on the ground floor here where they could never before. And suddenly all of Europe now is flooded with cheap Chinese automobiles. There's many ways to read this, but I think these are to some degree intentional policies, absolutely.
So how does this relate to the rise of the AfD? So from across the pond, I don't understand quite what the AfD is, because if you read regime press, if you read The Guardian, the AfD is the second coming of Mustache Man, right? It's the rise of the far right in Europe, which is kind of a left.
If only that were true, right? That would be great.
Right, but I've been burned by this before. I've been burned by these supposedly kind of like ultra hardcore populist parties. So could you explain what the AfD is? Are they growing or shrinking? And then also, does the regime seem to actually be afraid of the AfD, or are they like Maloney, where they can be kind of brought back into the fold?
Sure. So AfD were founded in the wake of the Euro crisis a few years after 2008. And they were originally just a Eurosceptic party, sort of libertarian, so forth. And since then, they've taken, I would say, a kind of light nationalist turn. And what's happened is the big sort of center-right party, the CDU and the CSU, the union parties, they originally in the 80s and 90s, there was this idea that they had to be a big umbrella for all, not just centrist, but all right-wing politics. So everyone to the right of center had to have a home somewhere in the CDU. And so the party had to cater to all of these ideas. And it was a deliberate strategy to represent the entire right-wing spectrum in German politics via the union. And this was deliberately, Strauss said this in, I believe, the 70s. This was the only way the party could survive. But they abandoned this policy for a kind of strategic centrism and, Merkel's famous strategy of asymmetric demobilization, where she borrows the political program of her opponents, of the Greens and the left, to deprive them of campaign issues. So they abandoned this and they moved more to the center, and they cut themselves off, basically cutting people on the right and leaving them out in the cold. So this is just as AfD is founded, and they start increasingly moving in a I would say light nationalist direction. They're not hard nationalists, but they start moving to take advantage of this unrepresented sector of the political space, which has been left by the CDU's own triangulation strategies. So the AfD really rises to fill a space that most AfD positions and most people now who vote AfD would have been perfectly comfortable as union voters, when my parents were young, so in the 80s, let's say. So the AfD really reflects the sort of central leftist drift of the union parties, and also their decline, because as they've moved to the left, they've lost a lot of voters. So the AfD is now this broad tent on the right. So they're not centrist, they're on the right. They're overall a light nationalist tendency, but they also, because they're a broad political tent, they also include harder nationalist groups inside of them. So it's all of these things. It's, you vote AfD just as a protest party, you don't like European interference, you don't like the EU, that's one way. You're anti-Atlanticist, you think you're mad about Nord Stream, you can vote AfD. Also, if you're a real nationalist, it's also the party for you. So they are sort of a big tent, but overall direction is light nationalists. They're not fascists or anything like that. They demand things like more direct democracy, more distance from European Union and post-war international organizations and so forth.
Got it. So how much of the rise of that has to do with the migrant crisis in Europe? I know that Germany doesn't seem to have the same scale of issues with migration as the Southern European countries. I do realize that's also relative. The migrant crisis is hitting everyone hard. But is that sort of a position that the AfD has staked out? There was recently a news story saying that some member of the AfD party, and I don't know who it was or how important this was, had basically signaled that he would have been in support of deportations. Is that an issue that they are kind of gaining ground on?
Well, now, yes. So the AfD first begins to be really prominent and ceases to be just kind of a small niche party right in 2015 with the self-imposed migrant crisis under Merkel. So absolutely, they are in large part a reaction to the migrant crisis and the inability of European countries to manage their borders. As you say, it's not as bad as the United States, for example, but it's still pretty bad, especially for European countries have been much more racially homogenous than the United States. So it's for me, it's much more shocking seeing this happen here. I lived in the US for a long time. It felt a little bit different there. This feels really, I don't know, it's very foreign and somewhat disturbing. So the AfD really becomes important in that moment, 2015, 2016. And it's now that we are post-COVID, the borders are open again, and we're seeing similar levels of migration to that we saw back then. So we're back to 2016 or even somewhat worse levels of migration currently. That's definitely fueling AfD support, especially in the East, where economic conditions are worse, where they're much more like Poland than they are like West Germany, of course. and where they didn't have all of those generations of internationalist global indoctrination. So they react to this much more rationally. So AfD is especially big in East Germany for these reasons.
And one of the stories we hear in kind of the Anglosphere is every once in a while it seems like a politician threatens, or more than threatens, a ban on the AfD party. Is that serious, or is that just kind of political noise?
No, that can happen. So we have a very overtly managed democracy in Germany because of our evil deeds in the Second World War. So we are constantly suspecting ourselves, and we also very much suspect the East Germans of being anti-democratic. So democracy is kind of a religion here in a way it's perhaps not elsewhere in the West, where we're always indoctrinating ourselves and telling ourselves how important democracy is. We have an entire office, the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, which might sound good, but actually they are domestic political police and intelligence agency rolled into one. So they conduct surveillance operations, they plant informants, and they infiltrate supposedly anti-democratic parties. The entire AfD, so the federal level party, has been classified as suspicious, as being under suspicion of right-wing extremism since 2022. So they're subject to surveillance by our political police. And there are also similar, the state level parties in about half of the German states are also under surveillance. All of this happened since 2020 or so. And so really COVID was a factor here. Also, they were worried AfD would profit from this, and they began trying to crack down on them. So there are mechanisms for our constitutional protectors to ban anti-democratic parties. Now, this is not an easy process. It's rarely been done. If they go to ban the party, there's two questions. It could happen at the federal level, so AfD across Germany could be banned, or they could try state level bans. But it's a protracted juristic process. The parliament has to approve it, and then there's this whole judicial aspect. It will last a long time. It's uncertain it will succeed, actually. And even if it does succeed, you have to remember that the voters are still there. They still exist. 1 in 4 Germans roughly supports AfD, much more in the East, 1 in 3, or even more, 40% trending in Saxony. So these voters aren't going to disappear. The other thing that won't disappear are all the local networks, supporter networks, fundraising networks that AfD built, right? Those still exist. A lot of them could potentially rebrand themselves or emerge as other parties. And meanwhile, while a ban is being contemplated and being worked out administratively, support for AfD will just surge even more. So there are many ways for this to fail and go wrong and really blow up in their faces. So there's, on the one hand, while calls to ban the AfD emerge, especially in certain parties, so the SPD, the Social Democrats, are in long-term decline. They're very desperate, and so a lot of SPD politicians want a ban. The Greens are increasingly talking about this. They lose support. So there's also this sense that sort of, being a sour loser, having no other way of competing with the AfD. So then you begin to talk about potentially banning them. My own theory is that they may well try a state-level ban in the East. We have 3 big elections in Brandenburg, in Thüringen, and in Saxony in September this year. And AfD support is now so high, especially in Saxony and Thüringen, that it looks like it may be very hard for the parties that make it into the state parliaments to exclude the AfD from government. There's a lot of unknowns here. There's a new party, so the Sarah Wagenknecht party may throw the arithmetic off yet again. But it's looking like, if that's the case, the CDU won't be able to form an anti-AfD coalition without serious difficulty. So it will be very tempting, I think, for them to try a ban in either Thüringen or Saxony. So they might try a state-level ban to try to see how it goes. Is this okay? Can we get away with it? But even there, the costs are considerable because they'll drive up support in the other 2 states even higher. So if they try a Saxony ban, then there'll be a lot of enthusiasm for AfD in Thüringen and Brandenburg, for example. Maybe they try coordinated ban across all 3 states all at once, but that seems a little too obvious to me. I mean, I don't personally, I think that maybe they'll try a state level ban. It may or may not succeed. Very hard for me to believe they ban the party nationally.
Well, and this is something that I think needs to be explained. The way that European politics works is slightly different than the dual party system we have in America and Canada. I guess Canada's a dual party system. But essentially, because of the kind of multiplicity of parties, you have to build a coalition. And what that means is that like you've said, you've mentioned this, this stoplight coalition, the red, yellow, and green. And so you get these unusual bedfellows where we need to get, is it 2/3 or is it 51% in your government? That point is, you need to get odd groups of people together to form a majority. And so what we've seen before is, maybe not in Germany, but in other European legislatures, essentially when a quote unquote far right party gets in power, everyone aligns against them, no matter what. I believe this has happened in more of the Mediterranean world, but it does sort of seem like, when it comes down to it, there's a certain unity in opposition to the far right. Like, that is the enemy. Do you think that that's likely, that it'll sort of be everyone versus the AFD, or do the AFD have people who would be willing to join a coalition with them? Eugyppius, I don't know if you're speaking, but you've gone dead.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're clear now.
Okay, very good. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Right now, all the major parties have basically resolutions in place to refuse to work with the AfD. So this is the cordon sanitaire, or we call it the Brandmauer, to keep the AfD out of government. But what makes this complicated is that the parties also have similar refusal or incompatibility resolutions against each other. So to take the CDU, for example, they have resolutions also against working with the left party. This is the party that is the successor of the DDR monopoly party. And so they won't work with the left either. And so in the East, where there's still a lot of former SED supporters, it's really hard. They can't form a coalition with either the left or the AfD. They'll have serious trouble forming a majority government at all. So the math gets very complicated, and you could see how really the CDU is going to be facing a serious internal crisis if they can't solve the AfD problem in one way or the other. That's sort of how. One other point I would add is that you don't get into either state parliament or a federal parliament if you don't get at least 5% of the vote in Germany. So a lot of small parties and so forth can eat up 10 to 15% of the entire vote. So you can achieve a majority in parliament with just, some cases, only 40 or 42% of the seats, right? Or 42% of the vote, because that gives you a majority of seats. This also makes the math complicated, but what it all adds up to is that AfD, if they get much near 40%, it's a serious problem. Now, these coalitions that they use to keep the AfD out of power, they ultimately hurt the CDU, the Union Party, because they force the CDU to collaborate with leftists, and a lot of their boomer voters really hate the policies that result from this. And so while the CDU can try to maintain this coalition system of excluding the AfD, in the long run, it's destroying the party, and they know that too. So we see what happens. What's happened most recently is that a faction within the CDU called the Werteunion, so the Values Union, which emerged in 2017 as a response to Merkel's flirtations with the left, they've now split off from the party. They've announced they're going to form their own party, and that they will cooperate with AfD if it comes to that. So even if the Werteunion is relatively small, but even if they only can get 6% or 5% of the vote in Saxony, that would be potentially enough to form a governing coalition with the AfD. So that is also a possibility.
So who are the international allies of the AfD? From what I've seen, it seems like there was kind of, for a while, and a lot of these men have been gotten rid of, but there was sort of a informal international populist network, with men like Bolsonaro, Trump, Netanyahu. And so, are there international friends for the AFD, or are they a pariah on the world stage?
No, I would say, of course, most or many AfD voters who I know find Trump to be a fascinating political figure. They thought Bolsonaro is interesting. Millet is another figure that a lot of AfD politicians like to talk about right now. Again, the party has a lot of different currents. There are the libertarian parts, there are the nationalist parts, and there's different analogs that are appealing to the AfD internally. But I have to say that I don't feel like the party is very connected to politics outside of Germany. Their sort of nationalist or light nationalist focus keeps sort of attention on Germany specifically, and so while there are these interesting analogs abroad or other European parties, maybe even PiS in Poland and so forth, they're more symbolic importance or something. They're not they're, there's not very substantive as far as I can tell.
Well, that's very helpful. I think it is always difficult when you were reading across a language barrier, because very often the only thing that gets translated or the only thing you hear from is kind of official government sources, is basically regime mouthpieces. And so it's difficult to tell, is this international axis of evil forming? Is that essentially like, liberal wish fulfillment, or is there actually something there? So that's helpful. So you mentioned that you were on the ground at this farmers protest. Can you describe, what that looked like and what you saw at this event?
Yeah, of course. So there was, I think, perhaps 20,000 at least participants. There was official police counts say there was at least 5,000 tractors and other vehicles. There would have been more, but there's just not enough space for them on the main boulevards around the Victory column and in the Tiergarten and before the Brandenburger Tor. I was there the day before on Sunday, I think, yes, Sunday, and I talked to some participants, and I found them very politically appealing and friendly and just ordinary people. So you can't, expect them to have, absolutely correct nationalist opinions or whatever, but basically correct attitude, anti-European Union or Euroscepticism, the kind of light nationalism you also see in the AfD. Many people are, because of the media coverage, are too uncomfortable to talk about their support or potential support for AfD. Many will say, "Oh, but that's a very bad party," but you know for sure they're voting for them. Then and their placards and all of their statements, it's a very general critique about the Scholz governments, about the current direction of German politics, about the energy crisis, about migration, about all of the stuff all of us talk about, and excessive taxation, not just the diesel taxes, but of course in Germany you pay 50% of your salary to the government just to start, and that doesn't include all kinds of other taxes and everything. So I thought it was a very, very positive protest. The protesters had instinctively alighted upon a good message. And what's really a sort of a tragedy about it, and what makes me worried, is that it's their leaders. So the German Farmers Association, this big sort of trade association, is determined basically now to shut it down. And so Joachim Ruckwied, who's the head of this Farmers Association, who's very government adjacent, all mobbed up with the corporate world and so forth, this kind of guy, he basically says, no, this protest is not about any of these other issues. It's just about the diesel tax. Withdraw that and we'll go away. He told all the protesters on Sunday to go home anyway and just call their elected representatives. He's doing everything he can to shut it down. And so what's most important now, I guess, is whether that works or whether the protest has achieved enough independent momentum that he can no longer control it. So we have to see what happens.
So is this abnormal for German politics? The stereotype in the US is that Germans tend to be, very polite and very kind of unwilling to do unreasonable things. They tend to be even keeled. Is that true, or are these type of protests the norm?
No. So Germany is not like France, for example. So we don't have a big tradition of street activism, except for the left. I think all of our countries have sort of quasi-regime-sponsored leftist street operations. That's the case in Germany as well. But these sorts of populist protests are rarer here. They're not as common. So things like the yellow vests, which I really hope this can develop into, is not really that normal for Germany. Another factor here, I think, is just that Germany has a very old population. We're right up there with Italy in being oldest in Europe. And there's just not a lot of energy in the population in general. A lot of people are retired. It's really kind of a sad thing to basically live in sort of a national nursing home, but that's kind of what Germany is ending up like. So this kind of energy, street level energy, is hard to summon, but definitely there are younger people out there. It's there. You can do it. It's just the forces seem to be against it. So no, I would say this is somewhat unusual, but also Germany is also a country, I would say, one of these political consensus countries where there's not supposed to be a lot of dissent. Everyone's supposed to be on the same page as the regime. And seeing a government as unpopular as this one is also super unusual. Generally, governments enjoy, even if people don't like them very much, they still express their support for them to pollsters and so forth. The fact that the Scholz coalition government now has only 32% support in the latest polls, and Scholz himself, only 20% of the population supports him. These are really, really low numbers for Germany. So we're seeing several unprecedented things, very, very unusual level of public displeasure with the political leadership and a protest.
How has this protest been covered by the media? Have they addressed it? Have they tried to minimize it? Or are they reporting on it accurately?
Yeah, so they can't really minimize it because they were everywhere. Even in my little village, there were 100 tractors blocking the only road through town. So everyone sees it. They were everywhere. So it's hard for them to minimize. So the line the media took at first was that the protesters are being instrumentalized or infiltrated by the right. That was sort of the excuse for it. And that I found to be, though it was a lie, somewhat encouraging, because the farmers in Germany enjoy a lot of cultural and social prestige. I think maybe it's similar in the United States. And for this reason, it's hard to attack them directly. So they had to come up with the narrative that they're being instrumentalized by bad actors, but they are themselves still virtuous and good, just a little bit clueless. That was kind of the narrative there. Then what happened, of course, we had this, I don't know if you want to talk about it, but we had this big manufactured freak out about AfD politicians meeting with Martin Sellner in Potsdam and plotting the deportation of German citizens, like at the Wannsee conference in World War II, only perhaps even worse. So the media now has been in constant freak out about that, and that has allowed them to sort of play down the farmers' protest. So that's sort of been the coverage.
Well, and I don't want to get off topic on this, but I think that that's one of the things that's been useful to watch, is that the regime is incredibly adept at sort of narrative judo. If you remember a little over a year ago, a transgender person, I'm going to speak carefully here, perpetrated a massacre at a Christian school and very clearly said, this is because I don't like white people and I don't like Christians. And what's interesting about that is obviously it's a horrible tragedy that, should be thoroughly looked into. I'll leave it there. But the story very quickly changed from that. The story then became, oh, the state where this happened is racist because there's a black person in the Senate who was removed for causing a ruckus about this. And then the whole story completely changes, not to the event itself, but to kind of a minor procedural detail and how that implicates the people who are kind of targeted in this tragedy. Similarly, you see something with the Canadian truckers protest, right? That if they can move away the spotlight from something that's uncomfortable for them, like the fact that everyone hates the ruling coalition, they're killing the country, but look at bad racists, this advantages them. That's always a play that they're willing to make. And so it's interesting to see that same dynamic, played out ostensibly in a completely different government.
Of course, the press is now that I write basically professionally on Substack, and so I read a lot of press every day, and also from many different countries. It's remarkable how you see the same strategies propagated everywhere in the American and Canadian media, same as it is in Germany, exactly the same tactics. It's I don't know, maybe there's a school they all go to learn how to do this or something, but it's very frustrating. In this case, I think both Trump in the United States and Alternative for Deutschland, they both have a kind of anti-fragile quality. That is, these media attacks, they are very satisfying for the leftists and their opponents, the globalists and so forth, but they also really show up support for the party itself. So what they attack the AfD in swear as racist and so forth, they are driving more support for the party. So maybe it is locally significant. They can push the farmers' protest to the back page, but meanwhile they're educating a lot of boomers on the fact that the AfD want to kick out all the migrants, and all the boomers are saying, well, that seems like a pretty good idea. Maybe
Yeah,
we
I
should do
didn't
that.
know that was an option. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's the idea.
Well, and that's what I think is, if we're talking big picture, why these stories are fascinating to me. We talk a lot in these circles about, elite theory. You and I have both mentioned a lot of concepts from this, but it's very clear that our elites are foxes and not lions. They prefer the indirect strategy. They prefer the nudge unit, to use a term from the United Kingdom. And in all of these, it seems like there are real structural problems in the West. We've mentioned in Germany, there's an energy crisis, there's a migrant crisis, let alone, the demographic issues of, native Germans. And in all of those, well, what is the solution? Well, we can't fix them. That would be too difficult. So we'll manage the perception of decline. And I think that, really since the end of the Cold War, that's what governance in the West has been, managed decline. And, the worst thing you can do is draw attention to that decline, it seems like.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's also very interesting. I was just watching the AfD has a YouTube channel where they clip out segments of parliamentary debate, and I was watching the AfD grill different members of the government on their various failures. And it's very interesting how the decline is also externalized. So every time they bring up the energy crisis or whatever, it's all Putin. He's doing all of this to us, the evil Putin, and it's the invasion of Ukraine, and it's all these external factors that are causing this decline, and we are just entirely powerless. And the only solution to this decline is more investments in, I don't know, global equity, and more the thing everyone's laughing about now is more cycle pathways in Peru, because it turned out the government has allocated several million euros for this, to build cycle pathways in Peru for some reason, the German government. And so there's the solutions are all this vague, global homo, green garbage that applies to everyone. So, we fix our own problems by, I don't know, giving money to the Palestinians or whatever, and the problems are all caused by external actors on us, and there's nothing to do about it. And I don't know how many people find this convincing. It's anyway what they're running with.
To me, the whole thing is very late Soviet. We're being ruled by this gerontocracy, of aging baby boomers and silent generation. And I mean, I think it's what's so fascinating about Joe Biden, that I'm not one of these people who thinks that Joe Biden is this, like mastermind pulling the strings. And I don't know how you could. To me, it's just very clear that he's a doddering old man controlled by more powerful people. And I mean, there's no better kind of picture of governance in the West than Joe Biden. A man who doesn't know what time it is, can only blame these kind of vague exterior forces, like the Soviets blaming wreckers for why they've missed another production quota. And, we're wrapping up. We're kind of coming to the end of our time. And one of the things I just want to say is, look, like, I hate this empire as much as anyone. And it seems like the Germans have sort of borne the brunt of American social engineering. And so I don't know if the AfD can do it. I've been burned with these kind of European right-wing parties before, but Godspeed. I hope you manage to do it. I'll put it that way.
Oh, thank you. It's very kind to hear. I would say that I think I'm more optimistic about the AfD now than I was even 3 or 4 years ago. In many ways, a lot of the things they have done to contain the party and shut them out and minimize them have made the party stronger. So the thing they should have done from the beginning is actually join them in coalitions, include them in government, because this tends to have a diluting effect. It makes parties, forces them to enact compromises. It fills parties with people who have more mainstream ideas. When you wall off a party like this, you create conditions for kind of ideological purity. And I would say AfD is perhaps one of the most cleanly demarcated anti-globalist parties in Europe right now, and they have a lot of support. So I'm cautiously optimistic about what they can achieve. And they are, again, their anti-fragility, which they continue to demonstrate, are very encouraging. The more they're attacked, the more there's talk of a ban, the better they do in the polls. And they've not compromised the message. They've never apologized. I'm fairly pleased with them so far. I mean, it can always go wrong, it can always be bad, but for the moment anyway, things seem to be pretty good.
Well, that's very good to hear. So as I said, Eugyppius, we're out of time, but if people want to find more of you and more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
You can just go to my blog at www.eugyppius.com, just a Substack, and I'm also on Twitter at Eugyppius1.
And both of those will be linked in the show description. I recommend both your Twitter account and your Substack. I've been a reader for quite a while, even before I ever had my own YouTube channel. If you want to support my content, the best way to do that is by following the show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to it. As I've said before, I've been pushing more onto the audio platforms. I get deboosted a lot less there. It's also to go back to a word we've used a lot, it's an anti-fragile system. YouTube, if you get banned once, you're done. But the way audio podcasts work, it's much more difficult to get rid of someone all at once. So if you do have a choice in where you listen, I'd appreciate if you moved it there. If you want to support me more directly, you can do that by supporting my sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Really been doing some good work there. If you use my link, I'll get a little bit of a kickback and you'll get a discount as well. If you want to read my articles, I've been writing more on Substack. Just had a new article out today, actually, from George Bagby, who's been on the show a number of times. It's quite good. I recommend you read that. It's available for free. And again, Eugyppius, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
And everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.